It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is my friend Heidi Barr, and we're going to be discussing her new book, What I Saw in Heaven: The Incredible True Story of the Day I Died, Met Jesus, and Returned to Life a New Person. Heidi, it's always a joy to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shaun. It is great to see you in person. We haven't seen each other for maybe 4 years?
Yeah, I think probably the last time I think you and I were a part of Randy's virtual conference a number of years back.
We were.
We did the interview for Two Christian Dudes. We've been on a few live streamy kind of things, but this is the first interview you and I are doing probably in 4 years. It is kind of funny. I'm not going to lie to the audience. This will feel a little bit like deja vu because I know Heidi's story so well. Randy and I feature it in one of our books, and so I'm going to feel a little bit like I've done this interview before, but I'll try to keep it exciting and ask things I didn't ask in the last interview. Heidi, I know for some of the audience, this is going to be the first time they're meeting you. We're going to get on early into the interview into your near death experience story, but I'd love for you to give us just a little bit of context for who you are, your background. You know, we could say this is kind of the elevator pitch version of the Heidi Barr origin story. So for somebody meeting you, give us a little bit of context for who you are.
I'm a country girl. I'm an Iowa girl. I'm an Iowa girl through and through. I don't live there anymore, but I will always consider myself an Iowa girl and a Hawkeyes fan. I'm a nurse, married to a retired physician. We have 3 kids and 3 grandkids. Our youngest grandson was born on the side of the interstate July 2nd of this year, delivered by his daddy at 3:23 a.m. So we're you know we're good. It's we kind of live in a rural area now, and I still love horses. Which, if you read my book, you'll see that I died because of a horse. But um, that's it. I started out in coronary care, intensive care, emergency room medicine, and then I moved into hospice nursing, which I did for most of my career. And I am now a retired hospice nurse. Take it from there.
That was good. Good. You gave us a little bit of context. 'Cause I feel like that's one of the things we can fail to dive into where we'll be like, "Oh, here, meet this person. They died and went to heaven," and that's all we talk about. But you have this whole. I mean, I think you were 16, I think, when you had your
I was
accident.
16. Yes, I
So
was 16.
you've lived a whole life since then and had a lot of other things transpire. I think the place I'd love to go next is just a little bit about the story behind the book. Now, this is your second book, and I'd love to hear maybe if you want to differentiate writing experience between your first book and this book, and then also you've shared your near death experience story in so many interviews. What was it like to uh, you know write it out for what would be a much larger scale audience consumption, because this is published with my friends over at Baker Books, so you're going to a very wide audience. So difference in maybe writing experiences, and then what was it like to really get ready to tell the story in a bigger format kind of book?
I wrote a hospice book, a book about my experience as a hospice nurse back in 2007. It was picked up and published by a very small publisher in 2009. I sent that thing everywhere, and it went nowhere. And one of the things I found, and it's no longer available, was when they edited it, and I had no say in the edits, they removed any references to God or Jesus, for the most part. But I wasn't allowed to, I had no input. So when that publisher went out of business, they sold the book to another publisher. And same thing, I didn't have any input as to the story. So ultimately, what I decided to do, thanks to John Burke, who kept saying, write it down, write it down, write it down, I wrote the story of my near-death experience. And I happened to write it probably because for reasons when my father went on hospice. It was a very difficult story to tell when my parents were still alive. And because they still denied the entire experience. So it was actually really nice to be able to sit down, write the story, include everything I wanted to include, and tell the complete story, in addition to what led up to my near-death experience, and then some of what happened afterwards. And I was able to kind of bring it full circle to my parents' death. My father died in 2022, and my mother died 6 months later, just after New Year's 2023. So I was kind of able to close the circle, which was really important for me to do that. And the hospice book is no longer available simply because Baker Books has asked me to rewrite it, which I haven't done, and they would like to pick it up and re-release it.
Well, I will heartily endorse that as a good idea. I'd like to see that book back out there with the God aspects that you'd like to tell
Mhm.
around the stories that you share in there as well. That's fantastic. I think let's jump now into, well, no, I have one more book related question.
Okay.
In terms of experiences, what was it like to work with, if you contrast your first writing experience working with the team at Baker? Now, full disclosure, I was part of the team at Baker for 5 years, and just editorially, they're phenomenal. Their design teams are phenomenal. So you worked with kind of a almost more of a self-publishing leaning kind of experience, just about to, Baker's #3 biggest Christian publisher here in the States. What was it like working with a bigger team to bring a message to life?
It was great because I actually had, not only did they help and support me, I had input. There were no changes made to the manuscript that I did not approve of. Basically, it was what I submitted to them, although they changed the order of chapters, which was great to have someone do that for me, to reorganize things in a coherent fashion. That it was just super easy. I didn't have to worry about the marketing, and they actually would prompt me, which is really nice, to say, well, we have this scene here, but let's see a little more of this scene. Could you flesh out this scene? Could you flesh out your relationship with this person or that person? And that actually helped me to see a bigger picture in my own life. And I really appreciated that. I've never been able to work with a publisher that took such an interest in me and in my story. It was great.
Well, I'm glad to hear that things haven't changed since I left. Sounds like sounds like they're still doing a good job and taking really great care of their authors. And for authors who are shopping around between different publishers, I mean, that is, if they're, maybe they're in talks with us at Destiny Image and Charisma and the folks at Chosen or whoever Chosen's part of Baker. I do tell people, if you want to become a better writer and you want to be challenged, Baker's a nice place to start out because they do such a good job. They're editorially phenomenal, and they'll challenge you as a writer and kind of guide you and lead you. So, thank you for sharing about that. I always like to get a little bit of that contrast out there, because every nowadays, like, well, I can just self-publish and do all of this on my own. But the reality is, you don't have that team, that coaching, that partnership. A traditional publisher does bring a lot to the table that's going to be helpful. So I'm glad that was a good experience for you. Let's jump now into getting into your near-death experience. Like we've already alluded to, you were 16 years old. I think the place I'd love to start is talk to us a little bit about, for you, the significance of your horse. Sounds like she was your best friend kind of thing. Riding was this place of peace for you. Now, kind of set the stage of why, you know, that was such a significant relationship for you at that time in your life.
I I grew up in, like most of us, I grew up in a really dysfunctional family. And the one place I found solace was with my horse. I could be alone. I had peace, I had freedom, because every single thing in my life was not only dysfunctional and abusive, I was controlled. Every single thing in my life was controlled. It was micromanaged. So I had no freedom. Now, for whatever reason, my parents didn't have much interest in my horse. So she was my freedom. And I spent as much time as I could with her. Didn't have a saddle, which was turned out to be a good thing. I just rode her bareback everywhere. I'd ride her into town. I rode her to the local swimming pool one time. The community swimming pool. I rode her to junior high school once and tied her up outside for the day, and then came out and rode her back. She was everything to me. And it's ironic that the thing I loved the most was the instrument of my near death experience. And it wasn't her fault. It was it was an accident. And, the interesting thing for me is, and I would never recommend anybody do this, is a number of months before, I had been in such a bad situation that I had actually prayed for death. And then that happened. And then this happened to me. Like I said, I would never recommend that. And I would hope somebody in my situation would have resources and help and intermediaries. I didn't. So it was really ironic that she was what allowed me to meet Jesus.
Well, I think the place I'd love to have you go next is just one, talk about how it was just a normal day. There was no indicator that you were going to die and go to heaven. Like that is one of the things that always strikes me when people share about their near death experiences. You got up like you did every day, doing normal things, having no clue what was on the horizon. But take us into that day. What happened with it? It was kind of a with how you tell the story, like there were some concerning things, with the other gentleman and the horse he was riding. But it was just a normal day for you.
It was, and in fact, it was one of the more peaceful days in my life. My mom didn't have anything to do. She let me take my sisters and borrow the car. I had just gotten my license a few weeks before, and she was happy to have us all out of the house. So she didn't care if I took the car. I drove out to the ranch. The only thing that concerned me was there was an Arabian mare who was really difficult to control. And when I brought my horse in from the paddock, the woman who owned the mare and her husband were having an argument over whether or not he could ride the horse. And normally it was just her. I'd never seen her husband there before, but he happened to be there that day. And I thought, none of my business. I'm just going to get past them and get on my horse. So I did, and I took off up the trails. I was the only one out that day. There were other people around the barn, but I was the only one out on the trails that day, to the best of my knowledge. It was really beautiful. It was late April, early May, which is really interesting that I cannot remember the exact date, but it was late April. And at most, May 3rd would have been the latest it was. And it was beautiful. It was partly cloudy day. It wasn't too cold. It wasn't too hot. It was a little bit windy, and there were some big clouds moving across the sky. So when I came back after about an hour, I thought my sisters are probably getting bored. I should go back. But I didn't want to get off of my horse. I wanted to stay on her for just a little while longer. So I stopped at a place where I had a nice view. I had a nice view of the trees, the barn, the trails, kind of everything around me. I could see my sisters further down the hill. And I was just sitting there, and I was relaxed. And it was at that point that I heard hoofbeats, out of control hoofbeats. And you're not supposed to run back to the barn. If you've ever ridden horses, you don't do that. So I immediately understood that the man had taken out the horse, the Arabian, and she was out of control. It was very clear. I didn't see them yet, but I knew that's what had happened. And suddenly he came around the corner, and I assumed his horse would run straight down the hill to the barn, but she didn't. She turned off to the side where I was. And I had nowhere to go. I was at the end of a trail. I was boxed in. I had absolutely nowhere to go. I thought, surely she'll see my horse standing here and she'll stop. She didn't. I thought, okay, she'll, turn around, or he'll get her under control. But he had dropped the reins and he had no way to control her. I wondered if I should get off my horse. But then I thought, if I get off my horse, the only place I'm going to go is underneath that Arabian's feet. So I really didn't know what to do. So I stayed on my horse. The Arabian came down the trail directly at us. She barely missed us and managed to somehow turn herself around and take back off towards the barn. But in the meantime, my horse had gotten really nervous, and she was dancing around. I was trying to keep her under control. She reared up once. First time she reared up, I dropped the reins and grabbed her mane, and she came back down. The second time she reared up, her back feet stepped off the edge of the trail, off the sloping trail, and she flipped over backwards. Just completely over backwards. I hit the ground first, and she fell across my body. And when she hit my chest, that's when I left my body. That's when I died. And I was immediately up in the air, 30, 40 feet. I could see her. I could see everything happening down at the barn. I watched my horse roll over my dead body. And the only image that came to mind in that moment was Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy. I watched my body get tossed like a rag doll. I wasn't concerned about me. I had no interest in my body. I knew I was dead. I had absolutely no interest in me. I was only concerned that my horse not be injured. I was praying in that moment that she would right herself and she would be okay. And she was, and she did. She kind of slid down the slope and then ran to the barn. I could see my sisters. My little sister covered her face, covered her eyes with her hands, and started screaming. My other sister was in the car because she's allergic to horses, and she had her face pressed up against the window. And I was up there watching everything. And give me another prompt now. Ask me another question. I'll tell you more if you want, or we can go on to something else.
Yep. No, I know exactly where I want to go next.
Okay.
So you've entered into your out of body experience. You haven't really transitioned over to the other side, as we would say
No.
it yet. But you're out because you're no longer tethered to your body and you're in spirit form at this point. You are already experiencing your senses not being limited in any way. So I mean, I think you were able to see into the barn, like you could hear. Like, talk to us about how, you know, I guess let me ask it this way. So, one, did you have a sense of like pain when your horse fell across you, or did like your horse fell across you and you were instantly gone? So that, and then talk to us about how your senses changed as you're 30, 40 feet up in the air.
As my horse fell across me, I didn't have a sense of pain, but I knew I had this sense. I felt things breaking, to be honest with you. But it was when she hit my chest, and I suspect she hit my chest hard enough to stop my heart, commotio cordis. And that was, and I was instantly above my body. I immediately left, and I knew I was leaving. It was as if every single cell in my body stood still, and I left from every cell. So I had this sense that my soul was in every cell in my body. I almost had that sense. I was really found it interesting that I could see into the barn, that I could hear people screaming, I could hear the chaos. I found that interesting because I wasn't facing the barn door. I was behind the barn, but I could see it as if the roof had been lifted up. And the only thing that concerned me, because I knew I was dead, and I always, in my own brain, was the Star Trek analogy, Spock's brain, where Spock's brain is removed. And I just realized the body is a house built for the soul. It's like a machine built to house the soul, and I knew that instantly. And I had no interest in my body. Didn't care. Didn't matter to me. My only concern at that point was my sisters. And I actually said aloud, at least it seemed as if I was speaking aloud, I wish my sisters didn't have to see me die. That's what I said. And it was in that moment that I noticed a light over my shoulder. And it's not the sun, because it was a golden light that flowed over my shoulder. If I could explain it, like golden water flowing over my shoulder. And it was illuminating everything in front of me. And that's when I looked behind me to see the source of the light. And I saw a man, and I recognized him instantly. And he moved forward, and I said, "Hi, I know you." And I knew it was Jesus. There was no question in my mind. This was Jesus, which shouldn't be the first person I would think of. And I've been asked, well, maybe it was an angel. No, it wasn't an angel. Maybe it was a hallucination. No, it wasn't a hallucination. He was the most real thing in the universe, but it was Jesus. And that was sort of at that point when I saw Jesus, I lost any interest in what was happening below us. And my entire focus was Jesus.
Well, and a clarification question there. So you're still in your out of body experience, kind of on this side of the veil, if you will. A light starts shining down on you, so to speak, and Jesus shows up. I think yours is one of the few stories I've heard of where Jesus shows up on this side of the veil, if you will. That's fairly, because I've heard of people seeing demons on this side of the veil and various things. Yours is one of the few accounts I think I've ever heard where Jesus pops up on this side. So that's more just an informational point. I think about these things after encountering so many of these stories, like just the logistics of where things are happening. Talk to us a little bit about what was it like to transition from your out of body experience, sort of on the earth side of the veil, to the, whether we want to call it heaven, the afterlife side of the veil. What did that look like, feel like for you?
I still felt like I had a body. I know Jesus had a body. I could see all of him. And it still felt to me as if I had a body. I could touch him, I could hear him. Sometimes we spoke aloud, sometimes I just heard him in my head or my heart. But I definitely had a body. I saw my bare feet on our journey to heaven. And yes, it was Jesus this side of the veil. There was no question in my mind. This was, you don't, you can't mistake Jesus for anybody, even if you don't even, I didn't know him personally at that moment, but I did know him personally. I he'd I'd been praying to God since I was a very small child, and I realized, or I learned quickly, that the God I'd been praying to was Jesus slash God the Father. It was still Jesus. So when I had my life review, and I did have my life review right there above the scene of my accident,
So,
and I
still on this side of the veil,
fell on this side.
also extremely, extremely unique.
It was, yeah, we were up there. I was ignoring everything that was happening beneath us, but I had my life review right there, and I saw that when I was a little kid praying to God, it was Jesus. And I always pictured God as a man sitting at the head of my bed. And that's exactly where he'd been sitting when I was talking with him. But at some point in time after my life review and um, not the judgment, because there was no judgment or condemnation at that point, I was judging myself. I was looking at my actions in my life, what I had done, and Jesus was supporting me and comforting me and helping me to understand the impact my actions and my words had on other people. And it was after that he and I left. We traveled very quickly. We were going really fast. And ultimately, we crossed what I can only describe as a threshold. Now, I know most people say there's a threshold they couldn't cross or a barrier they couldn't cross. And that happened to me later, where I saw a veil between myself and other people in heaven. But we crossed a threshold. We went right through a door almost, if I can describe it that way, because there aren't really words to describe what you're doing, but that's the only way I can help picture it. Once we went through that threshold, he took me directly into a light, and I saw this light, and it was alive, it was love, it was pure, it was blemishless or sinless, and it was God the Father. He took me directly to meet God the Father. And within, all of a sudden I found myself sitting on God's lap, and I couldn't see his face, but I was sitting on his lap, and he was a very big God, and I was like a little kid. I remember sitting on his lap, kicking my feet like a little kid with my face buried in his chest. Now, Jesus and God the Father are the same, but I can't explain that. But I knew they were both there, but they were one, but they were the same. And it makes perfect sense when you're dead. It just doesn't make sense here. And it was from the vantage point of sitting on God's lap that I ultimately saw what he showed me of heaven. And believe me, I didn't see all of it. I didn't, I'm not one of those people who saw a great city. I saw, I guess, more the garden part. But what I realized when I was sitting there was God took up all space and time. He was infinite. So in order to show me what he wanted to show me, you have to almost picture this infinite God wearing an infinite white robe made of light, having to pull back, having to withdraw some of himself so he could show me what he covered, what was underneath him. And that's when I began to see heaven. Now, heaven is amazing, but God and Jesus are more amazing. So they truly, I truly appreciated heaven, and I thought it was beautiful and astonishing and astounding, and the music was glorious. But God was the God and God slash Jesus. That was the most important thing to me. The only thing I can tell you is when you look on Jesus' face, you can't look away. You don't want to look away. His face is radiate so much joy and love and warmth and humor and laughter and kindness and compassion. And I would have stayed with God forever if they hadn't sent me back. So,
Well, and just a little bit of commentary. Like Heidi's experience is interesting in the sense, especially that she first encounters Jesus, then she encounters the Father. What's intrigued me and Randy with so many of the stories that we've helped share through the last several years is like people seem to encounter God how they need to encounter Him, and so
mhm.
like it totally makes sense knowing more of your story, like how you needed to encounter Jesus and the Father in your time in heaven. Like it seems so logical now, but I remember the first time I heard you share your story. I was so intrigued by you being in the Father's lap, which I
Mhm.
think just makes so much more sense now. Um, if you had like how I don't want to get overly into the details because we have way too far to go to finish getting through what I want to share in the interview today. Like where how many different places did you go in heaven? Like did you like you said you kind of saw more gardens and things like that, but what were some of the different things you saw or places you went, like what that looked like for you?
Well, I actually didn't go anywhere. I stayed on God's lap and he showed me. The what was really interesting is even though I was looking across a universe, I was looking infinitely far away. I could see everything as if it was right in front of my face, just inches from my face. And the first thing I saw was grass. And this is what will stick with me until I see it again. The grass was so perfect and so green, and I could see every single blade of grass. And it was like the essence of green. And I realized looking at the grass that yes, it was really similar to the grass we have here, but everything here is a shadow or a reflection of what is in heaven. I saw, and then I looked a little farther, still from God's lap, and I saw patches of flowers, all different colors, beautiful flowers. And my eyes were riveted on these flowers that looked like irises. They were a deep blue. I could see every part of every flower. I could see all the little veins in each petal. And my eyes kept coming back to those flowers because they were just so beautiful. Then I looked further and I saw grove upon grove of giant, massive trees, and they were all living. These are living beings. These are alive in God's light. Gives life to all these things. And the thing that fascinated me was I could see every leaf on every tree and every vein on every leaf on every tree. And I was really far away and I could see that. So it was as if God was showing me, allowing me to see this piece by piece. I kept looking farther, and I ultimately saw a path leading up through this meadow. And I, the path widened out, and I could see people coming towards me, and they were singing, but I couldn't see their faces. And it was as if there was a veil between them and me. And the interesting thing was, and this is why it's always stuck with me, is the grass. And believe me, I didn't know anything about the Bible. I really hadn't read the Bible, but the grass was singing. The grass was singing the praises of God. And everything that I saw was moving in the light of God and swaying to the song of the grass. And when I saw the people coming, they were also singing praises to God. But it was at that moment when I was looking at these people that Jesus reappeared and told me I had to go back. And he and I had an argument about it and ended up having to come back anyway. But he put up with my argument. So,
I think the best way I've heard it said, and this was by my friend Gabe Perot, Earth is like the Walmart version of heaven, and trying to contrast just we don't have colors, we don't have words, we don't have things sufficient here to describe what you and others have encountered in heaven. And I loved kind of what you described in terms of what God was showing you, because it really speaks again to just the heightened senses. Everything is dialed up to 11. It's just so extreme
mhm.
compared to the limited abilities we have here when we're tethered to our physical body. Uh, you just mentioned, you kind of had this argument that you didn't want to have to go back. You knew you were going to have to experience pain and suffering if you went back. One of the things that has you have several very unique kind of beats to your story. you probably have one of the most violent, like what I call reentry experiences of kind of going back to your body. Uh, and then again, I've read and listened to, hundreds of interviews and interviewed so many people in the NDE space, and again, yours is wholly unique. I don't think I've ever quite encountered. I don't know. Have you heard other people's stories where they've had a similar experience? Because your reentry was pretty rough in my estimation.
I know some people do get shoved in, but I've never heard anyone say they had that sense of claustrophobia that I had. And I mean, I literally, Jesus shoved me in. And I can only describe it as being almost vacuumed in. I was hoovered in and from underneath my body. And my whatever soul or spirit body I had, and I'm going to assume it was spirit body, hit the inside of my skull. And I panicked. I had an absolute panic attack and I was struggling inside my body. And then Jesus was in there with me. So, and he made me whole. And that was horrible. Believe me, I knew I was going to experience pain. And at that point, I still was not in pain. I was still not part of my body. But he stayed with me in my body until I was one whole person again. He like meshed me together. And he had left me with some final words, which are in the book, and ultimately left me with his Holy Spirit. But then I could not remember how to do anything. I couldn't remember. Well, first of all, I couldn't move from the waist down, but I couldn't remember how to do anything at all. And finally, I was able to crack open one eye and take a breath and say Charlie's name, who was the rancher who was kneeling beside me, crying and praying. And I was pretty shocky for a while. I did tell once I didn't get to the hospital until the next day, but when Charlie brought me home and my mother left me under the supervision of my 11-year-old sister, I did tell her everything that happened. That was about as much talking as I could do that day. I was in shock and really weak and really quite broken. And so, yeah, that was a really violent reentry. And if it wasn't for, well, I knew Jesus was going to help me, but that was the only time I was frightened. That was the only time I was frightened was when I hit the inside of my skull. And I could actually see it, which is really weird. I mean, I could see the bones. It's strange. So,
And, in terms of people who've heard you share your story before, whether that was on Two Christian Dudes or the many other places you've done interviews, are there for people who've heard you tell your story, are there new things they're going to encounter in how you share the story in this book?
definitely, I kind of felt there had to be context this, because encountering Jesus changed me. I mean, it basically was a 180-degree turn in my life. And I would not be here were it not for my encounter with Jesus. I would not have survived my teenage years. And um, while the near-death experience itself is really interesting and intriguing, and everyone wants to hear about heaven, it's what do you do with that? The proof is in the pudding. And it's kind of, in a sense, it's hard to integrate, and in another sense, it's not hard to integrate at all. This was the most real thing that had ever happened to me, and I accepted it. And I wanted to tell everyone. I tried, and I was rejected by most. I was rejected by my family. Wasn't allowed to talk about it. But although there were a few people in the hospital. I was in the hospital for a long time, and I really didn't have a lot of visitors. But the staff used to come in and ask me to talk to them about it. So if anyone ever asks, I tell them I do not impose my experience on anybody. But throughout my life, I've told very few people until I met John Burke, who said, "Tell people, tell people, tell people," because I feel like I don't want to impose my experience on anyone. We all live our lives. We all are in part of God's plan. But I came to realize, when I came to understand a little bit more, that there is something to share, and that something to share is Jesus. it's like I can't keep him to myself. And I had been feeling the urge inside to start sharing this for a number of years before I even met John Burke. But why I hesitated was because I didn't want to cut off all contact with my parents and my family, and I was concerned that that might happen. In the end, it was okay, but in the middle, it was not okay. And I didn't. I was, despite everything, I was reluctant to break all, to destroy the relationship with my family.
Well, and I want to get to a little bit more about uh, kind of the interesting bookends for you of growing up Jewish, culturally, religiously, and then how that kind of weaves in well with your faith journey right now. But there's one more question I wanted to ask related to like coming to terms with a near death experience. On average, I think they say it takes about 7 years for somebody who's had an NDE to. I always say it takes that long for our brains to catch up with what the download you got doesn't fit in the brain you still have on this side of the veil. For you, you were a teenager. You were 16 when this all happened. Like, what was the trajectory or time frame for you to not necessarily get comfortable with telling the story, but just kind of come to terms with it? It's a lot for adults at any age to deal with having an experience like this. What was it like for somebody who had this experience at 16 to kind of really grasp the gravity of what had happened?
Years. It took me years. I knew which direction I wanted to go. I knew that for instance, when I went to college, my I'm a nurse, but my initial college major was creative writing. My minor was religious studies with an emphasis on first century Judaism / Christianity and biblical Hebrew. I knew the minute I woke up, I wanted to know more, but I wasn't quite sure where to turn. And I did go to Israel a year after my near death experience. I graduated a year early from high school. So I went to Israel at 17 because of all the things I wanted to do, I wanted to walk where Jesus had walked. I wanted to see the places he had seen. I wanted to be there because I figured I'm never going to see him again this side of the grave. So I want to go there. Now, as a Jewish kid, that was not a problem for my parents. And I did live in Israel for a year. I almost stayed there forever, but I did come home for reasons. Um, but I would say 7 years isn't bad. That's probably about, I would say, probably when I had my first child, a lot changed, and I became much more serious about learning about Jesus in particular, studying and reading my own scriptures. And I did start reading in Israel, but learning what it meant, learning what I needed context for my experience. I had no context because I had minimal exposure to the Hebrew scriptures, certainly not the Psalms, not the prophets. I knew the 5 books of Moses, but that was probably about it, in the book of Ruth, book of Esther, but I didn't know much else. I knew Jewish history. But I needed context. I hadn't read the New Testament. And when I did read the New Testament, I read it almost in one sitting. I think I just sat down and read it. And I was like, this book is so Jewish. How can you even understand this book if you're not Jewish? This is a totally Jewish book. So then I kind of felt like, this book had been kept from me. It was sort of taboo. It was, if I pick up this New Testament, I'm going to burst into flames. And I didn't. And I got context from my experience. And I was able to then look at how the New Testament pointed back to the Old Testament, and how the Old Testament pointed forward to the New Testament, or pointed forward to Jesus. And I still study. I have 3 rooms in my house that are full of books on Jesus and Christianity and Judaism and Jewish history and first century, especially the first century. And it's just an obsession of mine. So I still study. I'm just finished one of N.T. Wright's new books on Acts. I'm obsessed with learning more about how early Jewish Christians lived and dealt with what they had experienced, which was, in my opinion, equally hard or way harder than anything I've experienced. So, and they encountered, to encounter Jesus and to encounter the risen Jesus. It's pretty amazing.
But I'm fascinated that you have, as you describe it, an obsession of really understanding kind of those first century Christians, especially Jewish Christians, because that's how you're relating into your faith journey. Talk to us about that interesting balance you've had to walk as somebody who grew up in a Jewish home. I assume when people find out you came up Jewish, but now you're a follower of Jesus, everybody wants to probably label you as messianic. And with how you self describe yourself, you seem a bit more nuanced than that. Talk to us about if somebody says, "Oh, clearly you must be messianic." Like how do you respond to that? How do you explain you as a Jewish follower of Jesus?
Well, sometimes I'll use Messianic Jew. Sometimes I will use that term because it's a catch-all phrase and people understand it. But the way I see myself is I'm a follower of Jesus. The early Christians were known as followers of the way. And that's kind of how I see myself. I follow the way. I follow Jesus. I don't really label. I love Jewish tradition. I love Jewish festivals. They're great. I love them. I still participate in the Jewish festivals. I liked the Orthodox community I grew up in. I liked it. I liked the traditions very much. And I like Christianity as well. So I just live in both worlds. I still participate in the Jewish festivals, and I'm part of a Christian congregation. I don't I straddled the fence for a long time, and I thought, am I Christian? Am I Jewish? What am I? And then John Burke actually said, you're Jewish. You don't have to worry about it. You're Jewish. Jesus' first followers were Jewish. You don't have to define yourself. And I'm like, oh, this makes it so easy. I am a Jesus follower. I am culturally Jewish, and I love being Jewish. It kind of being as a Jew, I'm a born skeptic, which is kind of good. Um, I don't. I mean, if I were to hear my account, if I were to just be a random Jewish person hearing my account, I would think, wow, she's a little nuts. But because Jews are born skeptics. And it's actually not a bad thing to be cautious and skeptical, because the truth is, it's not so much the ND that's important, it's Jesus that is important. And it's pointing back to everything he did and accomplished. And like I said, I needed context for that. I knew he was Jesus and I knew he was God, but I didn't understand the whole Christian Jewish history. So learning that, studying that gives me context and helps me understand helps me understand what I grasped when I was dead, which I can no longer totally grasp because, as you know, when you're dead, everything makes sense. You don't have any more questions. When you come back, you only know I didn't have any more questions, but I don't remember everything, which to me makes perfect sense. You shouldn't remember when you come back. I don't think you're allowed to remember when you come back.
Yeah, I mean, when people are on the other side, they talk about, having spirit to spirit communication. If you have a question, you just know the answer,
Mhm.
and it's just that simple. And yeah, again, the only way I can describe it, on the one hand, it seems like God sometimes holds things back from people remembering things, or they remember as their brain is able to deal with what their spirit encountered on the other side. Like people like Randy has had progressive revelation on the things that he saw in his heaven
Mhm.
experience. But again, the best way I can describe it is our finite physical brain has limited capacity to deal with it all, and so it just seems like A, some things you can't remember. B, sometimes it just takes 7 years, and and further
Yeah,
revelation from the Holy Spirit to come to terms with that sort of stuff.
I would agree. Sometimes it takes time because there are certain things that, as I said when we were talking before, I remember now, but I can't put them in context. I can't put them in the timeline of my time with Jesus. So, yes, there are things I remember, but I don't know when he showed me or told me these things. So, yeah, you do. It does seem like you remember more when you're capable of handling it. And that's a really good way to put it, that you, I will never, I'm sure when I'm on the other side, yeah, then yeah, I'll remember. But right now, it just seems like you remember more when your brain is capable of dealing with it. Because when you're a kid, you can't deal with all of this.
Yeah, and I think even sometimes too, like in God's infinite wisdom, there can be a timing aspect where He allows people to step into things for certain seasons when that
Mhm.
part of the message they've brought back is relevant for what God is doing. I mean, God is so crazy purposeful in all the things that there can often be a little bit more intentionality than we're thinking about. I have more places I want to go than time, but I'll try to pick the best few as we
Okay.
try to wrap up. Talk to us a little bit again about choosing to close the book with your parents entering the afterlife like that. I felt like it was you take us into a lot of windy paths of your coming up in your life and your experience with your parents and the difficulties you faced there. But then you bring us into this whole farther end of the journey of walking with your parents as they enter the afterlife. Talk to us about the decision to include that and just maybe some of the redemptive aspects for you in kind of the broad context of your whole journey.
In many ways, I felt like the timing was God's timing. I didn't start writing the book. The day I started writing the book was the day my father was admitted to hospice. And he lived 3 months on hospice. Um, and I didn't finish writing the book until after my mom had died, 6 months after my dad died. And I felt like this was God's doing. This was not my he this wasn't me. This was God. My parents and I had had a very challenging relationship always. It seldom got easier. There was never like an I'm sorry for them or forgive me. There was a little bit from my mom, and that's true, and that's in the book. But there was a lot of I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you, like Peter of 70 times seven or whatever Jesus told Peter when Peter said, "Should I forgive someone 7 times 7?" And I think Jesus said whatever 70 times seven or something like that. There was just a lot of I forgive you, we'll go on from here. I forgive you, we'll go on from here. But there was never any true reconciliation. And even up to almost the point of my father's death, there was no true reconciliation until his death, until almost his death, maybe 24 hours, 36 hours before his death. That's when the true reconciliation and forgiveness and redemption began. And in the end, my father, who was an atheist and was terrified of death, had a very peaceful, loving death. And I do believe, if you read the book, I do believe he met Jesus and accepted Jesus at the end. My mother, I know she did. She actually had a little near death experience before she died, 10 days before she died, and her last words to me were so remarkable. My mother had dementia, but she did not die of dementia. She ended up dying of a number of other things. But uh, 24 hours before she slipped into a coma, I had my mom back, and her brain was completely restored. All her memories were restored. It was remarkable, and she was able to talk to me about everything. And before she slipped into a coma, she asked me her code word for asking about my near death experience, because we were never allowed to talk about it in our house, was, "Didn't you have a bad horseback riding accident? Didn't Charlie find you? Do you think Charlie's still alive? Do you think Shady Lane Ranch is still open?" That was your code for "I want to talk about your near death experience." And those were among the last things she said. And she winked at me, and I knew exactly what had happened. And, you know, her last words before she slipped into a coma were, I was there with my husband and my oldest daughter was there because she's local. And we said goodbye to my mother. And she said, "You go have fun. You should have fun." And she said, it was broke my heart. She said, "I never had fun in my entire life." And her very last words were, "Life was meant to be fun." And I know exactly what she meant. Life as God intended it was not meant to be so broken and so sad and so tragic and so full of suffering. And I knew exactly what she meant. And then she slipped into a coma. Um, I've seen a lot of death. I'm a hospice nurse, and both my parents had very unusual deaths, very atypical. But my mom, for 10 days, slept like this. Every once in a while, she'd reach up and scratch her nose, and she'd put her hands like this, and then she died. The most peaceful death I've ever seen. And I actually was not at her bedside when she died, but I did have the dream of her death and was awakened from that dream by a phone call from the facility, the memory care facility that she had passed away. So she's in a good place.
Well, and when I got to the part in the book about your dream, I was like, wow, that to me that almost falls into the category of a shared death experience. Now, a shared death experience has a range of meanings in the near death experience sort of discussion space. On the one hand, sometimes people who are with a loved one when they're dying actually are taken into a vision and like see and experience what the person who's dying is experiencing, which is one sense of that. Other people talk about having visions or dreams of their loved one as they're dying. It seems to me like yours is probably that latter one.
It was the latter category. Yeah, it was a latter category. And I definitely saw my mom having fun. And I definitely saw her get on the train to heaven. And it was amazing. It was amazing.
And then this is just more of a comment. We really don't need to jump down this rabbit hole, but in terms of like consciousness studies, and for those of you who aren't just reading kind of the story books that you see more in the Christian space, where they're telling a story about a heaven experience or a hell experience, more of the secular and mainstream side of this discussion, there's a lot of talk about consciousness and what does it mean for our state of consciousness as the soul becomes more like or more untethered or further untethered from the body. And I don't. This isn't the right. I don't think this is the right terminology that you would get in a lot of those books. But like what you describe about your mom sounds kind of like that deathbed resurgence, where it's almost like whatever was holding them back physically, mentally, they've become untethered from whatever the illness is that is affecting their body, and your loved one becomes like a fully functional person all of a sudden with all their memory and for a very short period of time. And so again, if you want to learn more about that, there's a lot of books that will try to address that. Probably not from a very Christian perspective, but it is a common thing that comes up a lot in discussion and studies in this whole NDE space. As a hospice nurse, did you see that with patients from time to time that they would have that same kind of resurgence?
I did. And I was going to make that comment that as a hospice nurse, I did see patients wake up from a coma and have 24, 36 hours of complete consciousness. They were totally here. And a lot of them told me they'd been in heaven, and they came back because one of the things I used to tell families is if your loved one really needs to say something, they will come out of this coma and say it. And it was my experience in all my years as a hospice nurse that people did that. People came out were in a coma for any variety of reasons. Maybe they had a stroke. Maybe they had years-long dementia. Maybe they had cancer, brain tumor, whatever. But and it did not happen with everyone. So I couldn't assure people it was going to happen. But I did find quite often that people did one of two things. Either they said everything they had to say and slipped into a coma and died, or they came back briefly. And usually it's very brief. Sometimes it's only a matter of an hour. It might even be 20 minutes, but they're there. They're completely and fully restored, and then they're gone. So yeah, it didn't shock me, but it's still a miracle. It's still a gift from God when it happens, and it does not happen all the time. Sometimes And who knows? This is God's God. It's not up to me. You know, God does it or doesn't do it, but or
And it,
maybe the person chooses. I don't know.
and it's one of those aspects of the dying process that when we're medically, scientifically, as far as testing, like nobody can make sense of how or why this works, why
Mhm.
the person comes back temporarily. Because the other challenge with that, it's not like you're going to perform a bunch of tests and scans on a person who's on their deathbed. If you've ever gone through hospice care, all that stuff ends long before you get to that point. But it is a regularly occurring phenomenon in these kinds of hospice and deathbed scenarios. I think the place I'd love to land here before we wrap up is just have you comment on the contribution from your sister. I was surprised. That was another unique thing that was at the end of the book that I thought was very helpful and interesting. Why did you decide to include a contribution from your sister?
You know, she and I worked so hard to restore our relationship after my dad died. And it had been all of us kids had been at times distant from each other. It was just dealing with my dad was very challenging. And we would try to maintain a relationship and something would happen. And then we would try to restore the relationship and something would happen. But this time we really got down to business and we prayed and we went to a forgiveness counselor who was a Jewish Christian, Messianic Jew. And we worked so hard on the issues we'd had all of our lives, setting those aside, putting them behind us, forgiving each other, and we reconciled for good. There was no barrier between us. There wasn't anything tearing us apart. And she asked me if she could contribute to this book. And I said, absolutely, please contribute to this book. I would love it because many of our experiences were parallel. They weren't exact, but we had similar encounters. We knew the same people. And she is a practicing Jew. She's very Jewish, much more Jewish than I am, a very spiritual Jew. But she did study. She knows who Jesus is. She knows about my experience and she's always respected it and she's always listened to me. So she's never said, "Oh, you must be making that up or that can't be true." No, she knows it's true. And in terms of how she ultimately accepts or rejects it, that's her. That's up to her. She's very honest in her contribution that she is not a Messianic Jew, that she is considers herself Jewish, but she knows about my experience and honors it. And it was so sweet of her and so touching. I was so glad she wanted to contribute. It meant a lot to me because it also helped to make me feel less isolated. All of my life, in terms of my family, I felt isolated. There are secrets people keep. You keep secrets in your family. We all do. And made me feel not so alone to be able to, that we shared similar experiences.
And Heidi, in terms of the reader's journey with the book, they get to that last page. Like, what's the thing you want them to remember, or maybe what's the takeaway you hope every reader sees? Because on the one hand, you go through your near death experience at length. We get into your life journey, your backstory, all the ways God redeemed your life, the redemption that comes with your family in this latter part of your journey. There's a lot of things that people could focus on, but for you, like if everybody gets this thing, like this is the one thing I want every reader to see.
I think the one thing is Jesus gives hope. Loving Jesus, knowing Jesus, accepting him gives hope because this world is such a challenging, difficult place. Every one of us lives a difficult life. And I don't care if you think my life is great, my life is terrific, I have everything I need. We all we all suffer, we all have our challenges. Jesus is still the hope that we can look at. Like we can look forward to that. We can look at his face. And like I say, I couldn't look away from his face when things are challenging in my life. It's still his face that I see. So I think my message is hope. Is
Well,
that
and
okay?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. Well,
It's a
and what Randy and I love about your story and your passion for making sure that people grasp that Jesus is our hope, that is one of the things that sometimes in a grievous way is lost in some of these near death experience stories where it's a heaven story, it's a hell story. People just they get caught up in kind of the drama and everything that's happening in the narrative. But oftentimes in these books, we can fail to give people an opportunity to process and really grasp that in the end it's all about Jesus. If you don't want to go to hell and you want to go to heaven, it is through Jesus. And so there are missed opportunities if we don't tell these sorts of stories correctly. So I love that you shared that in the interview. I love how you get into that in the book. And whether you're a person who has had an experience and you're sharing it, don't miss out on that opportunity to tell somebody about, in the end, this is all about Jesus. Or if you're somebody who's passionate about these sorts of heaven and afterlife sorts of encounters, this is the universal apologetic.
yeah.
We all want to know what happens when we die. We all have loved ones who have already passed on. We want to know that our loved ones are on the other side. Almost anybody you encounter to some level wants to have this discussion with somebody at some
Mhm.
point. So, even if you're going to share a book like Heidi's or one of Randy's in my books, just make sure you use it as an invitation at some point to also tell them about Jesus. Don't miss out on that. Heidi, in terms of connecting with you, finding out more about the book, all the things, where can we discover you on the web?
The book is on Amazon. It's at Barnes and Noble. It's probably everywhere that books are sold. I think by the way, just this is a plug for the person who did the audio book. She's amazing. I listened to it and she had me crying. She did
Oh
a really
man,
good job.
the how she differentiates a bit with voice and intonation and everything. Like probably top going to be in my top 10 in terms of narrators I've heard an audiobook from
Oh,
in
it was
2024. She killed it. It was great.
she did, and I actually thanked her and she said, "Oh, that's so sweet. I don't usually hear from authors." I'm like, "Why not?" She was amazing. Because I read the book. I had to read it so many times when I was editing that it was like, I can't read this anymore. But listening to it gave me a whole new perspective. Um, if you want a website, my website is one word, newheaven.biz. And no, it's not a business, it's just a static website. Eventually, I may get around to posting, and it simply has a link to my book. That's it. And a little brief bio. That's about it.
Well,
So
and all
I don't have a social media presence, by the
that's
way. I really don't.
That's okay. For lack of social media presence, you've sure done a lot of interviews and people have heard about your story. Again, I'll vouch for the audiobook. That is how I consume this content to get ready for the interview. And I'm extreme as a guy who's been editing and doing post production on podcasts for a decade. I'm super picky about audio, and the narration was phenomenal. The editing was great. So I highly recommend, if you're an audiobook person, get the audiobook. It's fantastic. And Baker has done a good job of getting distribution. I see this book in every bookstore I go into lately. So
Oh, cool.
great job, Baker sales team, for getting Heidi's book out into the wild. But we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and show notes to Heidi's website, links to where you can pick up your very own copy of the book, all the things. It'll be linked up for you right there. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Heidi Barr. Once again, our book today was What I Saw in Heaven. And Heidi, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Shaun. It's great to see you again and chat with you.